There's a particular kind of tired that does not arrive from movement, not from long days, not from lack of sleep. It settles somewhere quieter, a heaviness that lingers even when the body is still, a fatigue that feels less like needing rest and more like having reached a limit that was never clearly defined. Sometimes it appears as indifference, sometimes as numbness, sometimes as a quiet sentence repeating inside, "I don't have anything left." Not dramatic, not collapsing, just empty in a soft, confusing way. You can still function, still respond, still move through familiar motions, and yet something underneath feels thinned, like a flame that has not gone out, but has stopped giving warmth. This exhaustion is not loud, it does not demand attention, it simply waits, and over time it becomes familiar. There's a moment when a person starts noticing small changes that feel almost too minor to name. Noticing happens quietly. It does not arrive as a breakdown, not as a sudden inability to continue. It arrives as subtle distance, a distance between what is happening and what is being felt, a distance between reactions and meaning. Things still register, sounds still enter the ears, faces are still recognized, conversations still happen. But inside, something responds more slowly. Not absent, just delayed. Moments that once created warmth now pass without much texture. Events that should feel heavy land softly as if wrapped in cotton. There is no sharp pain attached to this, no clear sadness, only a thinness, a sense that emotions have become lighter, flatter, less layered. At first, this thinness can be mistaken for calm, a quieter mind, less reaction, fewer internal storms. From the outside, it may even resemble stability. From the inside, it feels different. It feels like effort has increased, even though nothing new has been added. Smiling requires a little more energy. Responding requires a little more presence. Caring requires a little more reach. Not enough to stop doing these things, just enough to notice. And noticing often carries a strange guilt, because nothing is obviously wrong. Life may look acceptable, functional, ordinary. Responsibilities are still met. Messages are still answered. Plans are still kept. So the question forms softly, why does everything feel heavier than it should? Not heavy in a dramatic way, not crushing, heavy in a dull way, like carrying a small weight that never gets put down. This is often the first shape emotional exhaustion takes. Not collapse, not despair, but a quiet internal slowdown, a gentle dimming, a reduction in emotional range. Highs do not rise very high. Lows do not fall very low. Everything gathers near the middle, a middle that feels strangely empty. Some describe it as numbness, others describe it as fog. Others simply say, "I don't feel like myself," but even that phrase feels incomplete, because self has not disappeared. It feels more like it has stepped slightly behind a curtain, still present, still breathing, just less accessible. There can be moments of brief return, a laugh that feels real for a second, a memory that suddenly stings, a song that unexpectedly lands. These moments can feel confusing, because they prove something is still alive, yet they also highlight how rare those moments have become. So a person begins to adjust without realizing it. They lower expectations of their own inner life. They stop checking in as often. They move forward using habit instead of feeling. Wake, prepare, go, return, sleep. Not robotic, not detached, just automatic. The body knows the sequence, the mind knows the script, but the heart participates less fully. This stage of exhaustion is quiet enough to hide from others and from the person experiencing it, because there is no dramatic story to tell, no single event to point toward, no clear explanation, only a subtle awareness that something has shifted. And subtle shifts are easy to dismiss, easy to rationalize. Everyone feels like this sometimes. This is just adulthood. This is just stress. These phases pass. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they slowly deepen, not in intensity, in thickness, like fog becoming denser without ever becoming a storm. A person may start spending more time alone, not because of sadness, not because of anger, but because interaction requires more energy than before. Silence feels simpler, not necessarily comforting. Just simpler. They may find themselves scrolling longer, sitting longer, lying down earlier, not always to sleep, sometimes just to stop being engaged. Engagement begins to feel expensive, not painful, expensive. And there's often a quiet grief beneath this. Not grief for something specific, not grief with a clear object. More like grief for an internal version of oneself that used to feel closer. The version that reacted more easily, cared more instinctively, felt more available. This grief does not usually form words. It appears as small sighs, longer pauses, staring a little too long at nothing. The person is still here, still moving, still functioning. But there's a growing sense of being slightly out of sync with life, as if the world is moving at one tempo, and the inner world is moving at another. Neither is wrong, neither is broken, but the mismatch is felt. This is not yet the feeling of being done. It is earlier than that. It is the quiet noticing, the first soft recognition. Something inside is tired in a way rest does not seem to fully touch, and that realization does not arrive as panic. It arrives as a small, honest sentence. I don't know why I feel this way. A sentence that sits, not demanding answers, just existing. There's often a belief that exhaustion must come from excess. Too many tasks, too many hours, too many obligations. And sometimes that is true. But emotional exhaustion does not always grow from what is added. Sometimes it grows from what is held, from what is carried quietly, from what is repeatedly pushed aside. Long before anyone feel empty, they usually learn how to adapt. Not consciously, not with intention. Adaptation happens as a kind of emotional reflex. A child notices which feelings are welcomed, which are ignored, which create tension, which are inconvenient. They notice which parts of themselves make others more comfortable, which parts receive approval, which parts create silence. Slowly, without language, small internal adjustments begin. A reaction is softened, a need is delayed, a disappointment is swallowed, not because someone says, "Do not feel this," but because experience teaches. Some feelings fit better than others. Some feelings move things smoothly, some feelings slow everything down. So the nervous system learns efficiency. It learns how to reduce friction. It learns how to keep things moving. This learning is not cold, it is not cruel, it is protective. It is the intelligence of a human trying to stay connected, trying to belong, trying to remain safe inside relationships. Over time, these small adjustments become patterns. Patterns become habits. Habits become identity. A person may grow into someone who is easygoing, strong, low maintenance, independent. Words that sound positive. Words that are often earned through quiet self-reduction. Not disappearance, but compression. Needs become smaller. Reactions become quieter. Boundaries become less visible. Again, not through conscious choice, through repetition, through years of noticing what keeps connection intact. This kind of adaptation often looks functional from the outside. The person copes. They manage. They handle things. They rarely fall apart. They may even be admired for their steadiness. Inside, something else is slowly forming. Because every unexpressed reaction still exists somewhere. Every delayed feeling still occupies space. Every unspoken truth still has weight. Not in a dramatic way. Not as a pile that suddenly collapses. More like sediment. Layer by layer. Thin, dense, almost invisible. The body does not forget what the mind chooses not to focus on. The emotional system does not erase experience, it stores. And storage requires energy. Quiet energy, continuous energy. So exhaustion begins long before it is noticed. Not when someone feels empty, but when someone has been holding too much without realizing it. There may have been long periods of being the listener, the stable one, the one who adapts, the one who understands, the one who doesn't make things harder. Not because they were asked to, because it felt easier than risking disruption, because it felt safer than creating waves, because it became familiar. Familiarity can feel like truth. I am just like this. I don't need much. I'm fine. These sentences are not lies. They are partial truths. They describe how someone has learned to survive, not the full range of what exists inside. Over time, the gap between inner complexity and outward simplicity widens. The inner world becomes rich, layered, unspoken. The outer expression becomes minimal. This gap is tiring. Not sharply, not obviously. Tiring in a slow background way, like running a program that never fully shuts down. There's also often a history of staying present in situations that feel emotionally mismatched. Staying when something feels off. Staying when something feels draining. Staying when something feels quietly wrong. Not because of weakness, but because leaving, speaking, or disrupting feels heavier. So the person remains, adjusts, endures, again and again. Each time nothing breaks, nothing explodes, which reinforces the pattern. I can handle it, and they can. That is part of the tragedy and the beauty. Capacity becomes camouflage, strength becomes invisibility. Eventually, the system begins to signal in the only way it knows how. Not with clear messages, not with language, but with dullness, with reduced emotional color, with a sense of internal quiet that is not peaceful. This is not punishment, not failure, not malfunction. It is the nervous system reaching a saturation point. Not dramatically, gently, like a sponge that absorbed as much as it can and no longer expands. The person did not choose this. They did not cause this in a moral sense. They adapted, they survived, they learned. And the cost of long-term adaptation is often not immediate suffering. It is gradual thinning, gradual flattening, gradual fatigue. By the time someone says, "I feel done," the exhaustion has usually been growing for years, silently, patiently, without accusation. There's a quiet paradox inside emotional exhaustion. On one side, there's the feeling of having nothing left. On the other, there's the reality that something had been working constantly, not in visible ways, not in ways that produce external results, but in internal ways. The mind and nervous system have been regulating, filtering, containing, softening edges, maintaining a version of life that remains functional. This kind of work does not announce itself. There is no moment where it says, "You are tired because you have been holding too much." There's only the sensation of low battery, a vague depletion, a sense that even small things require negotiation. Not resistance, negotiation. Can I answer this message now? Can I deal with this later? Can I pretend I'm okay for a bit longer? These questions are not strategic. They are not manipulative. They are small internal check-ins that happen beneath conscious awareness. Sometimes the body answers before language forms. Shoulders feel heavy, breathing feels shallow. Eyes linger on nothing. Energy drops for no clear reason. In psychology, there are words for this, but those words can feel distant. What matters more is the lived experience, the experience of being both capable and exhausted, of functioning and fading at the same time. This creates an inner conflict, because identity often becomes tied to capability, to reliability, to being someone who handles things. So when the inner system begins to slow down, it can feel threatening, not because things are falling apart, but because the familiar self-image begins to wobble. If I'm not the one who copes, who am I? This question may never be spoken. It exists more as a sensation, a subtle unease, a quiet resistance to acknowledging tiredness. Not denial, not lying. More like an instinct to keep continuity intact. The nervous system prefers familiar stories, even exhausting ones, because unfamiliar narratives feel unsafe. So a person may minimize their own depletion. They may tell themselves it's temporary. They may compare themselves to others who seem more burdened. They may push gently past their limits without labeling it as pushing. Not dramatically, just a little, again and again. Yet there are moments when awareness slips in, not as an epiphany, not as a breakthrough, more like a soft noticing. A moment where someone realizes, this feels deeper than a bad week. This feels older than today. This realization does not immediately change anything. It does not fix. It does not mobilize. It simply adds context. And context quietly alters perception. The exhaustion begins to feel less like a personal flaw, less like laziness, less like something that should be argued with. It starts to feel more like a signal. Not a command, not a threat. A signal that something has been asked to operate in sustained silence for a long time. Sometimes this awareness arrives through contrast. Remembering a past version of oneself. Not idealized, not perfect, just more emotionally available, more responsive, more textured. The comparison is not meant to shame, it arises naturally, as memory, as recognition. And with recognition, a subtle softening can occur, not relief, not hope, softening. The inner tone shifts from, "What's wrong with me?" to something quieter, something less sharp. "I have been carrying more than I realized." This sentence is not always verbal, it is often felt as a slight reduction in self-hostility, a slight loosening of internal pressure. The exhaustion does not vanish. Life does not suddenly feel light, but the relationship to the exhaustion changes shape. It becomes less adversarial, less like an enemy to defeat, more like a state to acknowledge, not celebrate, not romanticize, simply acknowledge. And acknowledgement does not mean approval, it means accuracy, seeing what is there without adding a verdict. There is a tenderness inside this moment, not dramatic tenderness, not cinematic, a small human tenderness, the kind that exists when a person stops arguing with their own nervous system for a second, stops demanding a different experience, stops insisting they should feel otherwise. Just for a moment. This moment does not solve anything. It does not guarantee improvement. It does not promise transformation. It does something quieter. It reduces friction. And reduced friction changes texture. The exhaustion remains, but it is no longer carrying the additional weight of self-blame. The person may still wake up tired, still feel low energy, still feel flat, but underneath there is a faint shift, not toward happiness, not toward motivation, toward understanding. Understanding is not exciting. It does not sparkle. It does not create dramatic arcs. It settles, slowly, almost invisibly, like dust falling in still air. There's no finish line here. No clear moment where someone becomes healed. No final version of self waiting at the end. There's only an ongoing relationship between inner systems and awareness. Sometimes awareness is present. Sometimes it fades. Sometimes exhaustion feels heavy again. Sometimes it feels distant. Nothing about this is linear. Nothing about this is clean. And maybe that is the quiet truth beneath emotional exhaustion. It is not a problem with a solution. It is a human state within a long human story. A story of adaptation, of endurance, of unspoken effort, of systems doing their best with what they have learned. The feeling of being done is not always an ending. Sometimes it is simply the moment when the body stops pretending it isn't tired. Not as a demand, not as a declaration, just as an honest sensation. And honesty does not arrive with instructions. It arrives as presence. A quiet, imperfect, incomplete presence. That does not fix. That does not conclude. That simply exists, like a soft light left on in an otherwise dim room. Not to illuminate everything. Not to chase away the dark, just enough to show something is here. Something has been here. Something has been carrying, and that noticing, gentle and unresolved, continues.